At midnight on November 15, 1942, the waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island were almost black. A low ceiling of clouds drifted across a fading quarter moon, while burning ships cast unsteady light across the narrow battlefield known as Iron Bottom Sound. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee was aboard the battleship USS Washington, leading what remained of an American force toward Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondō's approaching Japanese warships. Ahead of Washington, American destroyers were already being torn apart. Behind her, USS South Dakota was struggling with electrical failures. Kondō's battleship Kirishima was closing on Henderson Field with enough firepower to cripple the airfield and reopen the Japanese route to Guadalcanal. The immediate question was brutally simple. Could one American battleship find, identify, and defeat the Japanese force before the island's defenders lost their only effective shield? The answer would come in 7 minutes of concentrated gunfire. Yet the victory was not produced by firepower alone. Washington carried larger guns than Kirishima, but battleships had carried powerful weapons into Iron Bottom Sound before and still been confused, ambushed, or sunk. The decisive difference was the way Lee's crew combined radar, disciplined fire control, target identification, and command restraint inside one of the most chaotic naval battles of the Pacific War. Washington would not merely destroy an enemy battleship. She would demonstrate that darkness, long considered a Japanese advantage, could be transformed into an American weapon. The struggle had begun more than 3 months earlier. On August 7, 1942, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands in the southern Solomons. It was the first major American amphibious offensive of the war against Japan. The immediate objective was an unfinished Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal. Once captured, completed, and renamed Henderson Field, the airstrip allowed American aircraft to threaten Japanese ships moving through the region and helped protect the maritime routes connecting the United States with Australia. Control of that airfield became the center of the entire campaign. Henderson Field created a division between day and night. During daylight, Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft operating from Guadalcanal could attack Japanese ships approaching the island. After sunset, the balance shifted. Japanese cruisers and destroyers raced down the island chain, known as the slot, delivered troops and supplies, bombarded American positions, and withdrew before daylight exposed them to air attack. These nighttime runs became known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. They kept the Japanese garrison alive, but destroyers could not carry the heavy artillery, vehicles, food, and ammunition required for a decisive offensive. Japan needed a larger convoy, and that convoy needed Henderson Field neutralized. The danger was not theoretical. In October, the Japanese battleships Kondō and Haruna had approached Guadalcanal at night and subjected Henderson Field to a devastating bombardment. Battleship shells cratered the runway, destroyed aircraft, ignited fuel, and demonstrated what heavy naval guns could accomplish when they reached the island without opposition. The Americans repaired the field, but the lesson was unmistakable. If Japan's battleships returned while a major troop convoy was approaching, the thin American position on Guadalcanal might collapse. In early November, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized another attempt to change the campaign. 11 transports embarked approximately 7,000 Japanese troops, along with ammunition, provisions, and equipment. Major surface forces would protect their movement. Battleships would enter the waters off Guadalcanal at night, bombard Henderson Field, and destroy the aircraft before the transports arrived. The operation committed 4 Japanese battleships, several cruisers, more than 20 destroyers, and supporting forces under the overall direction of Vice Admiral Kondō. It was not a routine resupply mission. It was an effort to break American resistance and restore Japan's offensive position in the South Pacific. The first Japanese bombardment force reached Guadalcanal during the night of November 12 and 13. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan met it with 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. His ships entered a confused, close-range engagement against a Japanese formation built around the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. The American column suffered catastrophic damage. Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed. Cruisers and destroyers burned, sank, or withdrew with shattered bridges and machinery spaces. The later sinking of the damaged cruiser Juno added hundreds more deaths. By the end of the fighting, 1,439 American sailors had been killed. Tactically, the first night action had been disastrous for the United States Navy. Operationally, the sacrifice mattered. The Japanese bombardment was stopped. Hiei was damaged so severely that American aircraft could attack her after daylight, and the battleship was lost. Aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise also struck the Japanese transport convoy. Several transports were sunk or disabled, but the operation had not yet been defeated. Kirishima remained operational. Kondō still possessed 2 heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and a surviving battleship capable of smashing Henderson Field. On the night of November 14, the Japanese came back. Admiral William Halsey, commander of American forces in the South Pacific, had almost nothing left with which to stop them. His cruiser forces had been wrecked or exhausted. Enterprise, the only operational American carrier in the region, was still damaged from the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Halsey detached Washington and South Dakota from the carrier's screen and placed them under Rear Admiral Willis A. 4 destroyers joined the battleships: Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Together, they became Task Force 64. Sending battleships into the restricted waters around Savo Island was an extraordinary risk. Naval doctrine discouraged the use of capital ships in narrow, poorly charted waters at night. Large ships needed room to maneuver, especially when threatened by torpedoes. Iron Bottom Sound offered little room. Guadalcanal and Savo Island complicated radar pictures. Burning wrecks, friendly survivors, reefs, and enemy formations could appear almost simultaneously. Halsey understood the danger, but the 2 battleships were the only force available with enough power to confront Kondō. The American formation also lacked cohesion. Washington and South Dakota were new ships, but they had not trained together as a battleship team before November. The 4 escorting destroyers had not developed a common night-fighting doctrine with them. Washington had fired her main battery at night only twice, both during training early in 1942. South Dakota had never fired her 16-inch guns in darkness. The force had been assembled for a single emergency mission and sent directly toward an enemy whose Navy had spent years preparing for night combat. Rear Admiral Willis A was unusually well suited to the assignment. He was an experienced gunnery specialist who understood both the potential and the limitations of radar. He did not regard radar as a device that automatically produced victory. It was a source of information that had to be integrated with plotting, communications, fire control computers, trained operators, and commanders who trusted what they were receiving. Lee had repeatedly drilled Washington's crews in target acquisition and radar-directed gunnery. He had also worked with Captain Glenn Davis, Washington's commanding officer, to reduce delays in the transmission of information from radar operators to the men controlling the guns. Washington was among the most powerful warships then in service. Her main battery consisted of 9 16-inch guns mounted in 3 triple turrets. Each gun could fire a 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectile. 25-inch dual-purpose guns formed her principal secondary battery. Radar could search the surrounding sea, measure ranges, and support the electromechanical fire control system that calculated where the guns had to aim to hit a moving target from a moving ship. The process remained dependent on human judgment, but it allowed Washington to engage targets that her lookouts could barely see or could not see at all. South Dakota carried the same number of 16-inch guns and was one of the newest battleships in the world. Yet she entered the action with disadvantages. 2 guns in her second turret had been damaged during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and the ship had undergone rushed repairs after a collision. More importantly, her electrical distribution system would be tested under conditions no peacetime exercise had reproduced. The enormous shock of firing, overloaded circuits, battle damage, and human attempts to prevent breakers from tripping would combine at the worst possible moment. Vice Admiral Kondō's formation was more complex. His main bombardment unit included Kirishima and the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao. Atago served as his flagship. The light cruiser Nagara led 6 destroyers in a screening group, while the light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers formed a separate sweeping unit. Altogether, Kondō controlled 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The division of this force gave him the ability to search several approaches and launch torpedo attacks, but it also made coordination difficult in the restricted waters around Savo Island. Kirishima had begun life before the First World War as a battlecruiser and had later been reconstructed as a fast battleship. Her main armament consisted of 8 14-inch guns. She was older and less heavily protected than Washington, but she was fast, experienced, and entirely capable of destroying Henderson Field or crippling an American battleship. Her crew had already survived the savage engagement 2 nights earlier. Japanese heavy cruisers added 16 8-inch guns between them, while the destroyers carried the Type 93 oxygen-powered torpedo, later known as the Long Lance. These weapons possessed exceptional range and striking power, and left a far less visible wake than conventional torpedoes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its night-fighting doctrine through demanding pre-war training. Japanese lookouts were skilled, their optical equipment was excellent, and their formations practiced launching torpedoes before revealing themselves with gunfire. Earlier in the Guadalcanal campaign, that preparation had produced the American disaster at Savo Island. Japanese night attacks repeatedly demonstrated that radar alone did not erase their advantage. American commanders still had to interpret incomplete information, avoid shooting friendly ships, and survive torpedoes that many officers did not yet fully understand. During the afternoon of November 14, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft observed Lee's ships. Reports of what they had seen were inconsistent, and Kondō did not fully appreciate that 2 modern American battleships were waiting for him. Lee knew that Japanese forces were approaching, but he did not know their exact formation. After sunset, Task Force 64 entered Iron Bottom Sound in a single column. Walk led, followed by Benham, Preston, Gwynn, Washington, and South Dakota. The destroyers formed the advance screen, but they also stood directly between the battleships and any Japanese torpedo attack. By approximately 10:30 that night, Lee's force was circling north of Savo Island. Below the surface lay the wrecks of ships lost during previous battles. American cruisers from Savo Island, the light cruiser Atlanta, and the Japanese battleship Hiei. Magnetic disturbances caused compass needles aboard some ships to behave unpredictably. Above the water, the darkness concealed both fleets. Washington's radar searched through it, waiting for enemy echoes to separate from the landmass of Savo Island. The first contacts appeared northwest of the American formation. Washington's SG radar detected ships emerging from behind Savo Island at a range of roughly 18,000 yards. On the radar screen, the echoes separated from the larger image of the island one by one. Lee's operators could measure bearing and distance, but they could not immediately determine which echo represented a cruiser, a destroyer, or a battleship. Land interference caused contacts to fade and return. Information arrived in fragments. It was still vastly better than blindness. At approximately 11:13, Washington's fire control radar began producing usable ranges. Several minutes later, after lookouts obtained visual contact at about 18,500 yards, Washington opened fire on the Japanese sweeping group near Sendai. South Dakota followed. The muzzle flashes from 18 16-inch guns transformed the darkness. The blast rolled across the sound and forced radar operators to recover headsets shaken loose by the concussion. The first salvos fell around the Japanese ships, but neither American battleship inflicted decisive damage. The smaller targets turned away, and the engagement shifted toward the destroyers at the head of Lee's column. The American destroyers were about to encounter the strongest portion of Japanese night-fighting power. Japanese ships maneuvered around both sides of Savo Island, firing guns and launching torpedoes into the American advance. Ayanami, operating independently on the southern side of the island, engaged the American column. Nagara and other destroyers approached from another direction. The radar picture became crowded with ships, land echoes, shell splashes, and sudden changes in course. Walk was struck by a torpedo that destroyed her bow. Gunfire then tore through the wrecked forward section. Fires spread through fuel and ammunition, and the ship began sinking rapidly. Preston received repeated shell hits in her machinery spaces and aft section. Her fires illuminated the battlefield, making damaged American ships visible to Japanese gunners. Between Walk and Preston, more than 200 American sailors were killed. The ships that had been positioned to shield the battleships absorbed the full violence of the Japanese torpedo and gun attack. Benham was hit by a torpedo that tore away much of her bow. She remained afloat temporarily but could no longer function as an effective escort. Gwynn was damaged by gunfire in her machinery spaces. Within minutes, Lee's 4 destroyers had been sunk, crippled, or forced out of the main engagement. The carefully arranged American column had dissolved. Washington and South Dakota were now moving toward the Japanese force without an effective destroyer screen. Washington turned to pass the burning American destroyers on the side away from the Japanese. She moved through wreckage, oil, rafts, and men in the water at approximately 26 knots. Her crew threw flotation equipment overboard as the battleship passed. Survivors were documented calling for Washington to continue the fight. The huge ship could not stop. Halting inside a torpedo engagement would have endangered the battleship and every man aboard her. The only way to protect the survivors, Guadalcanal, and the remaining American ships was to reach Kondō's bombardment force. South Dakota attempted to follow, but her night had already begun to unravel. The shock of firing and faults within the electrical system caused circuits to overload. Breakers intended to protect parts of the system had been secured in ways that prevented them from operating normally. When a short circuit developed, the failure spread. Power vanished from critical sections of the ship. Gyro compasses, radar equipment, radios, and fire control systems stopped functioning. For several minutes, one of the most powerful battleships in existence was effectively blind. As Washington turned around the damaged destroyers, South Dakota encountered wreckage directly in her path. Captain Thomas Gatch could not follow Washington's exact movement without risking collision. He turned in the opposite direction. That decision placed South Dakota between the burning American destroyers and the approaching Japanese force. Fires behind the battleship outlined her silhouette. When electrical power returned, her crew recovered only part of the ship's combat capability. Japanese lookouts now had a visible target. Searchlights opened from the Japanese formation. Beams crossed the darkness and settled on South Dakota. Kirishima fired 14-inch shells from approximately 11,000 yards. Otago and Takao engaged with 8-inch guns at much closer distances. Light cruisers and destroyers added smaller weapons. Japanese ships also launched scores of long lance torpedoes. None struck South Dakota, but shell after shell hit her exposed superstructure. The battleship's armor protected her machinery, magazines, and buoyancy. Her upper works were far more vulnerable. Shells destroyed radar equipment, severed communications, shattered directors, started fires, and filled exposed stations with metal fragments and steam. A 14-inch projectile struck near the base of an after turret. 8-inch shells penetrated unarmored sections of the ship. At least 26 projectiles hit South Dakota during the action. Her main belt was not pierced, and she was not in immediate danger of sinking, but her ability to find targets, coordinate batteries, and remain in the battle was steadily destroyed. South Dakota returned fire when individual weapons and directors could operate. Her main guns fired toward Japanese cruisers and Kirishima, but electrical failure, damage, smoke, and confusion prevented the coordinated accuracy expected from a modern battleship. Men fought fires in dark compartments and attempted to restore circuits while heavy shells exploded above them. The ship survived because her armor and internal subdivision performed their essential purpose. She could absorb punishment. She could not provide Lee with the second battleship he needed. Kondō believed the American destroyers had been defeated and that the remaining resistance was collapsing. His ships concentrated on the illuminated South Dakota. To Japanese observers, she appeared to be the Central American threat. Washington was nearby, but burning wrecks, darkness, and the angle of approach concealed her from visual detection. The Japanese had found one American battleship. They had not found the other. Washington's radar had already detected a large target off the starboard side. The echo was Kirishima. Lee faced a critical problem. South Dakota's position was no longer known with certainty. Washington could not establish reliable radio contact with her, and the other battleship had entered a blind area behind the flagship. The large radar contact might be Japanese. It might also be South Dakota. Firing too early could send 16-inch armor-piercing shells into an American ship. Lee withheld fire. It was one of the most important decisions of the battle. Radar provided range and bearing, but it did not place a name beside every echo. Lee demanded positive identification before releasing Washington's main battery. His restraint cost valuable seconds while South Dakota remained under attack, yet it prevented a possible catastrophe. The decisive advantage was not merely that Washington possessed radar. It was that the men using it understood when the information was sufficient and when it was not. The Japanese resolved the uncertainty themselves. Their searchlights illuminated South Dakota, and their guns opened from the direction of Washington's radar contact. Kirishima's identity was confirmed. Washington's main battery trained toward the Japanese battleship. Part of the 5-inch battery was assigned to Kirishima, while other secondary guns engaged Otago and nearby targets. The range was approximately 8,400 yards. For 16-inch naval guns, it was extremely close. At midnight, Washington fired. 9 16-inch guns discharged almost together. Flame expanded from the barrels. The blast swept across the decks, shook equipment, and flattened loose objects. Each armor-piercing shell weighed more than a small automobile and left the muzzle at tremendous velocity. At 8,400 yards, the trajectory was relatively flat, and the time of flight was brief. Kirishima had only seconds between the flash of Washington's guns and the arrival of the shells. The opening salvo fell short or straddled the Japanese battleship. Radar measured the splashes and corrected the firing solution. Washington's plotting rooms processed changes in range, course, and speed. Turret crews loaded new projectiles and powder charges. Less than half a minute later, the main battery was ready again. The next salvos struck. Heavy shells penetrated Kirishima's superstructure and internal spaces. Hits near the forward section damaged communications and threatened the magazines serving the forward 14-inch turrets. Other projectiles struck amidships, opened large sections of deck, and caused flooding below the waterline. 5-inch shells exploded throughout the upper works, damaging directors, communications, funnels, and exposed gun positions. Fires spread as ventilation systems drew smoke and heat into the interior. Kirishima attempted to answer. Her 14-inch guns fired toward Washington, and several shells passed close to the American battleship. Japanese officers believed that some rounds had struck, but Washington received no confirmed heavy-caliber hit from Kirishima. At that range, a successful 14-inch salvo could still have caused severe damage. Washington's radar advantage did not make her invulnerable. Every additional minute gave Kirishima another chance to find the range. Washington's gunfire remained controlled and rapid. The fire control system continuously updated the target's movement. Radar allowed the guns to remain on Kirishima when smoke and shell splashes obscured the ship from visual observation. The Japanese battleship was soon surrounded by towering columns of water and explosions. Lookouts aboard Otago reported that Kirishima had become hidden behind shell splashes. A temporary ceasefire interrupted the attack when Washington received an incorrect report that the target might be sinking. Kirishima remained afloat and continued firing with part of her main battery. Within roughly 90 seconds, Washington resumed the engagement. Captain Davis authorized the batteries to fire at any clearly visible enemy target. More 16-inch shells struck the Japanese battleship. The range changed as the ships maneuvered, eventually opening beyond 12,000 yards, but the radar solution remained effective. One or more heavy shells damaged Kirishima's steering machinery. Her rudders jammed, and the battleship began turning uncontrollably. Other hits flooded compartments and disabled hydraulic systems needed to operate the after turrets. Fires threatened ammunition spaces, forcing the crew to flood magazines to prevent explosions. Fluting introduced to save the ship from fire added to the loss of stability. The crew attempted to steer with engine power, but damage in the jammed rudders made control increasingly difficult. The exact number of hits remains disputed. The official American assessment credited Washington with at least 9 16-inch hits and approximately 45-inch hits. Later examination of Japanese testimony, underwater damage, and the wreck has led some historians to argue that Kirishima may have received as many as 20 hits from Washington's main battery. The uncertainty reflects the conditions of the battle. Some shells that appeared to fall short may have traveled underwater and struck below the waterline. Other impacts could not be inspected because Kirishima sank. What is certain is the volume of fire. In approximately 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells and 107 5-inch shells at the Japanese battleship. The result was not an immediate explosion or a dramatic break in the hull. Kirishima's destruction was mechanical and progressive. Her steering was crippled. Her main battery was largely silenced. Fluting spread through damaged compartments. Fires and heat forced men from essential machinery spaces. The ship developed a severe list, then struggled to correct it as counter-fluting and uncontrolled water shifted through the hull. She could still float, but she could no longer fight or maneuver as an effective battleship. Washington ceased firing after Kirishima disappeared from effective action. Other Japanese ships now recognized the American battleship and attempted to engage her. Atago and Takao fired guns and launched torpedoes. Destroyers also maneuvered for attacks. Lee changed course repeatedly to avoid the expected torpedo tracks. Every torpedo aimed at Washington missed. Her speed, evasive movements, and the difficulty of coordinating the scattered Japanese formation kept the battleship alive. Kondō's command structure was breaking down. His screening and sweeping groups had become separated or displaced. Some destroyers had been ordered toward damaged ships. Others were arriving from the transport force. The flagship Atago and the heavy cruiser Takao remained dangerous, but the bombardment mission depended upon Kirishima. Without the battleship's 14-inch guns, Kondō could no longer guarantee the destruction of Henderson Field. He ordered his surviving ships to withdraw. Lee did not pursue recklessly. South Dakota's location remained uncertain, his destroyer screen had vanished, and Japanese torpedoes remained a lethal threat. Instead, he maneuvered Washington away from Guadalcanal, deliberately drawing Japanese attention from the damaged American ships. His objective had never been the destruction of every enemy vessel. It was the protection of Henderson Field and the prevention of the Japanese landing operation. Once Kondō turned away, that objective had been achieved. Kirishima remained behind. Japanese destroyers approached to assist, but towing the crippled battleship was impractical. Her list increased. Fluting and mechanical failures continued. Captain Sanji Iwabuchi and his officers ordered the ship abandoned. At approximately 4:23 in the morning, 7 miles northwest of Savo Island, Kirishima capsized and sank. More than 200 members of her crew were killed. The wreck settled upside down in the waters that had already claimed so many ships. Ayanami, damaged by Washington's secondary battery and other American fire, was also abandoned and sank. On the American side, Walk and Preston were gone. Benham's bow damage proved fatal. She was scuttled the following day after attempts to save her failed. Gwynn survived but required repair. South Dakota withdrew with extensive damage to her superstructure and combat systems. Washington emerged without a confirmed enemy shell hit, although the blast of her own guns damaged parts of the ship and destroyed one of her float planes. The outcome on the water determined what happened at Guadalcanal after sunrise. 4 surviving Japanese transports reached the island and ran themselves onto the beach. Approximately 2,000 troops managed to get ashore, but most of their ammunition, food, artillery, and heavy equipment did not. Henderson Field remained operational because Kondō had failed to bombard it. American aircraft, field artillery, and naval forces attacked the beached transports and destroyed their cargo. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had been lost with the convoy, and the men who reached Guadalcanal entered a worsening struggle against hunger, disease, and American firepower. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was the decisive final phase of a 4-day engagement. Across the larger battle, The United States lost cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, and more than 1,000 sailors. Japan lost the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, 3 destroyers, most of the transport convoy, and thousands of troops. It was not a clean American victory. It was purchased through the destruction of Callahan's force, the sacrifice of destroyer crews, and the punishment absorbed by South Dakota. Yet the strategic result was unmistakable. Japan's last major effort to retake Guadalcanal through a powerful naval and troop offensive had failed. Henderson Field survived. The transport convoy was destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again send a comparably powerful force into the waters around the island to deliver a knockout blow. Japanese troops remained on Guadalcanal for nearly 3 more months, but their position became increasingly hopeless. On February 9, 1943, organized Japanese resistance ended after most surviving troops had been evacuated. Washington's 7-minute attack is often described as a triumph of radar over traditional night fighting. That explanation is correct, but incomplete. Radar had been present in earlier American defeats. Equipment could fail, displays could be misunderstood, and information could be trapped inside separate compartments. South Dakota proved how quickly a modern battleship could lose its technological advantage when electrical systems collapsed. Washington succeeded because Lee and Davis had built procedures that connected detection directly to decision and decision directly to gunfire. The battle also demonstrated the continuing importance of judgment. Lee resisted the pressure to fire when Kirishima's identity remained uncertain. He waited until Japanese searchlights and gunfire confirmed the target. Once confirmation came, Washington delivered overwhelming force without hesitation. After Kirishima had been neutralized, Lee refused to turn victory into an unnecessary pursuit through torpedo-filled waters. His decisions before, during, and after the 7-minute engagement were as important as the machinery aboard his flagship. There was also a severe human cost hidden beneath the technical language of radar ranges and firing solutions. The information that allowed Washington to fight existed as clean points of light on a screen. Outside the armored compartments, sailors passed burning ships, men in the water, drifting wreckage and bodies. Destroyer crews fought with little protection against shells and torpedoes, designed to rupture much larger vessels. South Dakota's sailors restored power, carried wounded men, controlled fires, and remained at their stations while the upper structure disintegrated around them. Kirishima's crew flooded their own magazines, entered smoke-filled spaces, and attempted to save a ship that no longer answered her helm. The battle did not prove that the United States Navy had completely mastered night warfare. Only 2 weeks later at Tassafaranga, Japanese destroyers would use long-lance torpedoes to inflict another severe defeat on an American cruiser force. The lessons of Guadalcanal were still being learned, and the Navy would continue modifying radar organization, combat information centers, communications, and destroyer tactics. Washington's success represented a glimpse of what those systems could achieve when properly integrated, not the end of the learning process. For Japan, the loss of Kirishima carried consequences beyond the destruction of one battleship. Hiei and Kirishima had been lost within 2 days, not in a fleet engagement across the open Pacific, but in restricted waters while attempting to support troops on a contested island. The transports they were meant to protect were ruined. Experienced sailors, soldiers, and merchant crews could not be replaced easily. The Japanese position on Guadalcanal shifted from an effort to recapture the island toward an effort to sustain, and eventually evacuate, the isolated garrison. For the United States, the battle confirmed that the Guadalcanal campaign had become a turning point. American forces had entered the Solomons with limited resources, incomplete doctrine, and no certainty that the island could be held. They endured defeats at sea, heavy losses in the air, and repeated attacks on the ground. By November, however, American ships, aircraft, Marines, and soldiers were beginning to combine their strengths. Henderson Field made daylight dangerous for Japanese shipping. Surface forces denied the enemy a decisive night bombardment. Ground forces held the perimeter. Each element depended upon the others. Washington's attack was therefore greater than a battleship duel. Her guns did not act in isolation. The destroyers ahead of her absorbed the Japanese torpedo attack. South Dakota drew the enemy's attention and survived punishment that might otherwise have been directed toward the flagship. The cruisers and destroyers, destroyed 2 nights earlier, had delayed the Japanese operation. Henderson Field's aircraft had forced Kondō to operate at night and stood ready to attack transports at dawn. The victory was the result of a campaign in which every surviving force created an opportunity for another. Shortly after midnight on November 15, 1942, Washington entered that opportunity. One American battleship found an older Japanese battleship in darkness, close to a range measured in only a few miles, and used radar-directed fire to strike before the enemy fully understood that a second battleship was present. 75 16-inch shells and 107 5-inch shells followed. 7 minutes later, Kirishima was burning, flooding, unable to steer, and no longer capable of reaching Henderson Field. The unanswered question from the beginning of the night had been resolved. Washington had stopped Kondō, but she had done so only after the American formation had nearly collapsed around her. Technology supplied the sight. Training supplied the accuracy, armor and machinery supplied the force. Judgment determined when that force would be released. In the darkness off Guadalcanal, the United States Navy did not win because the battle unfolded according to plan. The plan had already been shattered. It won because one commander and one crew continued to understand the battlefield after almost everyone else had lost sight of it. In 7 minutes, USS Washington did more than cripple Kirishima. She preserved Henderson Field, doomed Japan's final major reinforcement attempt, and helped turn the waters of Iron Bottom Sound from a rout of Japanese advance into the barrier that stopped it.